Oh, welcome everybody. My name is Abraham Bonowitz. I'm the Executive Director of Death Penalty Action, and we're here today to talk about uh, gas suffocation enabling legislation in Arkansas. Such legislation is happening in a number of states: Ohio, Kansas, um, Arkansas now, and we're going to see where else it's going on. It's also getting set to be tried for the first time in Louisiana, where two execution dates are set. Um, March 17th and 18th. Louisiana's never done that, but they enacted this last year. They were one of four states that tried, and Louisiana actually was successful in implementing the legislation. And now they're going to try it, and we're going to see how it goes. Um, I'll share a little bit more after Reverend Dr. Jeff Hood addresses us. But I do also want to say that if you are here from the media, welcome. You have permission to record and broadcast whatever you hear today. We also have in the audience folks who are supporters of death penalty action or concerned people about this issue. We let people know that they could be in the audience, but this is primarily a press conference, and we're going to be inviting questions from the media, and we're going to ask everybody else to just kind of hang back and let this be a conversation for Jeff with members of the media who are here from Arkansas in particular, and there may be some others. With that, finally, I'll just say that Death Penalty Action is pleased to provide this platform. Reverend Dr. Jeff Hood is an ally and on our advisory committee, but speaks for himself today as an observer of executions. I will speak for Death Penalty Action. And with that, please welcome Reverend Dr. Jeff Hood.
Yeah, thank you, Abe. You know, it's interesting when I first experienced this nitrogen hypoxia execution of Kenny Smith back in January of 2024. I had no idea that I would need to speak to this method here in Arkansas, my home. There were a number of us who thought that if this actually happened, if the nitrogen was actually tried, that it would only happen once because we felt like it would be so horrific that people wouldn't want to do it again. And on that, I was wrong. We've now seen it progress to Louisiana, and we've seen it progress here to Arkansas. You know, it's interesting to me that we have dozens and dozens and dozens of legislators that have signed on to this nitrogen bill in order to change the protocol to expand it to include nitrogen hypoxia. But there's dozens and dozens of legislators that have signed on to this bill who have never seen a nitrogen hypoxia execution. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to convene this moment to be able to describe what a nitrogen hypoxia execution looks like. On the day of Kenny's execution, I was completely beside myself for a number of reasons. Kenny's execution is one of 9 executions that I've witnessed as a spiritual advisor to guys on death row around the country. 8 were lethal injections, and Kenny's was the only one that was a nitrogen hypoxia execution. The last execution I witnessed was just a few weeks ago, Stephen Nelson in Texas. But on the day of Kenny's execution, there was certainly uh, a feeling of unease for everybody involved. One of the things that the legislators are not talking about is the fact that I had to sign a release in order to be in the execution chamber with Kenny Smith, because the state of Alabama was concerned that they were going to gas me and their workers, their corrections officers, to death. Nitrogen is a horrific gas, obviously, tasteless, smellless, colorless. They were afraid that the nitrogen was going to leak from the mask and, again, kill everyone in the room. They're still afraid of that, which is why we have seen in every state that has considered nitrogen hypoxia executions, we have seen them get their employees and spiritual advisors who are going to be close to the chamber to sign releases. That's one thing that's not being talked about. As the execution proceeded, there were oxygen monitors all around the chamber. These oxygen monitors were meant to make everyone in the room aware if oxygen levels got low, if nitrogen leaked. The problem with such oxygen monitors is I didn't know what the beep sounded like. A number of other people in the room that didn't know what the beep sounded like. Um, but I think it also speaks to the fact that they were truly afraid that nitrogen was going to leak, and they're still afraid that nitrogen was going to leak. We go into the chamber. Kenny is affixed with what looks like a firefighter's mask, a firefighter's breathing apparatus. It went from here all the way under his chin and to here with straps going all the way back. The straps were affixed to the gurney. And so when I came in to pray with Kenny, I did so with him leaning over like this in order to speak to me through the mask. There was a thin hose that's connected it right here to a hole in the mask, and that hose went all the way back to a staging area that was behind him and behind a wall. And I prayed. He gave his last words, and those last words were somewhat difficult to hear because the mask sort of, I guess, muffled those words. Um, and I'm sitting there, and I think I and the corrections officers, and there was another state official in the room. There was four people in the room. Again, everyone's nervous when they realize that the nitrogen is about to turn on. The nitrogen turns on, and immediately Kenny begins to heave back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, over and over and over again. That glass faceplate on the mask repeatedly as he shot forward, the mask was affixed to the gurney. So every time he popped forward, he was hitting the mask over and over and over again, the front of his face. And so I watched this motion for 7, 8 minutes. We know that that's something that has happened over and over again as they've done these nitrogen executions again, 4 times in Alabama now. And with every thrust forward, again, his face is hitting the front of the mask, but also the inside of the mask is beginning to fill with body fluid, mucus, saliva, perhaps um, some blood, and it's all catching on the inside of the faceplate, and it's drizzling down. It looks like a waterfall of body fluid inside the mask. His body was um, grew redder and redder. The only way I know how to describe it is it looked like there were thousands, if not millions, of ants underneath his skin. It looked like everything was moving all at once. And again, he grew redder and redder. Um, I could see all of his veins, muscles tensing up. Um, he, he was unquestionably struggling to breathe, heaving, and as he's struggling to breathe, um, as he's struggling to breathe, His face looks like a tomato, and all of this is happening in the span of um, minutes. We're not talking about 30 seconds of involuntary movements. We're not talking about 45 seconds of, strange movements or anything like that. We're talking about minutes of utter horror. We're talking about minutes of utter torture. It was so awful that I began to look up, and the corrections officers and the other state official that was in the room, they began to shift towards the door. And as they are shifting towards the door, I became more and more frightened because there was this fear that nitrogen was leaking in the chamber. But ultimately, what ended up happening was that they were terrified of what they saw happening. Nobody expected it to be as awful as it was. From behind, I could hear multiple people cry out for it to stop. Please, 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 stop, stop, stop. And Kenny begins as he's heaving and shaking. The gurney is bolted to the floor, and the gurney begins to shake and to move. I had never imagined that that was even possible, that the gurney could move. You saw his legs go up and down. Um, the victim's family, later on, I believe that Abe has put one of the links in there. The victim's family comes out afterwards and says how awful it was for them and how the state lied in terms of what they said they were going to witness. I say all of this not to be an alarmist, not to, you know, poke and prod. I mean, obviously, I am opposed to the death penalty, but nitrogen executions are a whole nother level of torture and horror for all of the people who witness these things. It is mind-boggling to me that we have a state legislature where dozens and dozens of people have signed on to a method that they have never seen before. I don't imagine that there's anybody that wants to volunteer to show them what this looks like. Lastly, I'll say that the image of Kenny's face hitting the front of that mask over and over and over again haunts me. It absolutely haunts me. I can't imagine any legislator that would have witnessed this to want this to go forward. Again, you don't have to have the utmost compassion for the offender or for the condemned to realize that this is a really bad idea. You just have to have compassion for victims' families. You have to have compassion for corrections officers. You just have to have compassion to clergy in the state of Arkansas. I think that we are long past putting bags over people's heads, figuring out new ways to suffocate people. And I hope that instead of just allowing this to sail through the legislature, I hope that some of these folks in the legislature will take the time to listen. Thank you, Abe.
Thank you, Jeff. I'd like to just share a bit about the links that are in the chat. In particular, I put a link to the death penalty action petition, which has some information about the different places that are doing this and some of the past experiences as well. We have a link to the legislation in particular. We have a link to the Bolts magazine article that in particular was reviewing the execution of Carrie Grayson, a third person executed. There have been now 4 of these gas suffocation executions. And let's be clear also that the word nitrogen hypoxia is a misnomer. This is gas suffocation. And that's really what it ought to be called. There's a link, as Jeff mentioned, to the New York Times article that came out a few days after that execution of Kenneth Smith, which interviewed most of the people that witnessed that execution and has the remarks of the victim family in particular that Jeff mentioned. Also a link to the press conference that we did with Jeff and also Lee Hedgepeth, who was another witness to that first execution, and also the wife of Kenneth Smith immediately following that execution. So you can watch that as well. A link to our webpage and the most recent editorial that I'm aware of from NOLA.com, the New Orleans, I think it's the Times-Picayune, editorialized over the weekend, opposed to the executions by gas suffocation starting up in Louisiana. So there's a link to that. And finally, I also want to say that what we're seeing here is, it seems like it is a deliberate, behind-the-scenes attempt by somebody. I mean, now that we've seen Pam Bondi and Donald Trump's executive order about increasing the numbers of executions, and the federal government helping the states get what they need to carry out executions. I'm going to share my screen here. There's another link I'm going to share in a moment that is something that was discovered over the weekend. Also, this Wikipedia page that actually spells out all of the current people who have exhausted their appeals and also those who are immediately eligible for the death penalty, as if this is a prompt for states to decide, okay, it's time for us to get going. And it's almost as if so here it is in Arkansas, we've got 11 who have exhausted their appeals and 7 that are immediately eligible for execution, according to this. And we don't know who created this. And while I have us sharing my screen, I'm also going to share the front page of the Death Penalty Actions webpage, where you can find one of our featured campaigns, which is this petition, which has a lot of background information within it about different aspects of this issue. You'll see that we've targeted a number of states, as well as a company called Allegro Industries, which makes this mask that you can see here. This is a basic life-saving device, this respirator mask that normally it's the sort of thing you might see a firefighter put on, or somebody who's working with dangerous chemicals put on to receive oxygen. And they're using this precise mask to carry out the executions by, instead of putting life-saving oxygen in, exchanging the oxygen for nitrogen. And there's more details and information that you can find there. But I'll put that link to the Wikipedia here. And the point is that there's some sort of strategy going on. Somebody's passing around behind the scenes amongst attorneys general and state legislators across the country in states where it might be moved. We saw this immediately following the Kenneth Smith execution. We saw legislation introduced in Ohio. The Attorney General of Ohio, David Yost, and several legislators last year, literally, I think it was the Monday or Tuesday following that Kenneth Smith execution, they introduced the gas suffocation legislation, which it never moved out of committee in Ohio last year, but we know that they've introduced that legislation again. It still hasn't been scheduled for a committee hearing in Ohio, but that's happening. And we have also the leadership. I want to say, well, before I get to that, I'll also say that we're also seeing other forms of execution being advanced that would be easier. For example, there's legislation now in Arizona to make the firing squad a possible method of execution. Idaho has passed legislation. I haven't heard if it is signed yet, but they already had the firing squad, but they've passed legislation to make firing squad the primary method of execution. So, and for death penalty action, it is not about how we kill our prisoners, but that reduced. So when the system is as broken as it is, and we know that the system is very, very broken, in part because if you pay attention to what's happening in case after case after case of people that are going to execution, courts are refusing to even hear legitimate arguments on the merits of the arguments about constitutional violations. Things like there was a man executed in 2023 in Texas who turns out the jury foreperson used racist language in the jury room. And it was procedurally barred. It was too late to hear any question about whether that was a constitutional violation. It should have given him, that prisoner, at least a new sentencing hearing. And we're seeing people with evidence of innocence, that they actually didn't commit the crime, that is procedurally barred. We can't even hear it. And we're executing people like that. And that's what I mean when I say that the death penalty is so broken. For us, again, it's not about how we kill our prisoners, but that we're killing them when the system is broken. And we know that Arkansas has its issues. And I'm not going to get into all that piece by piece right now, but it's there. The racism, the disparity, county by county, only counties that can afford a death penalty trial put people on death row. What matters more is the prosecutor, the elected prosecutor, willing to spend their budget resources trying to get a death sentence, which is always a roll of the dice. Money, race, politics, geography, those things matter more when it comes to the who gets a death sentence and how long that death sentence lasts. But we know in Arkansas that they ran out of the lethal injection drugs in 2017. Y'all might remember in 2017, it turned out that they had 8 doses of the drugs that were going to expire, and they had to use them before the expiration date. They were that concerned about it, and they said 8 executions would take place over 4 evenings in an 11-day period of time, starting on Easter Monday. And they ended up carrying out 4 out of those 8 executions. So, and that's the last executions that we saw in Arkansas in 2017. And now they want to start it back up using this other method. So with that, we'll invite questions from the media. If you raise your hand or put it in the Q&A, then we'll send that over to Jeff. And Jeff, here's the first question from James Powell of USA Today.
Hey, hold on 1 second, Abe. Do we have anybody, I love James, but do we have anybody from Arkansas that's on here?
We do. We have several reporters from Arkansas, and they just need to raise their hand or ask in the chat. Let's see. Here's somebody. Let's see what we get. This would be Andrew Langford. Andrew, go ahead.
Hi. My question is, as far as like the rationale, are the legislators coming at this from like a cost saving perspective? Are they trying to somehow suggest that it's more or less humane? Like what's the rationale of why they're supporting this particular method over others?
Well, I think I can speak to that really quickly, because it's actually rather obvious. I mean, just in terms of what I mean by obvious is that they have intimated their their desires. I think the first is Um, it's more cost effective. There's no doubt about that. I mean, we're talking about a canister of nitrogen, a hose, and a breathing mask. Again, a firefighter's breathing apparatus looking mask. I think that it is since it's cheaper, it's also more efficient. They can do more of these quicker. And I think lastly, it's sort of uh, hard to get people to understand just how brutal and horrific and torturous these things are when nobody can see them. I mean, Andrew, something that I've long thought about is how, you know, juries and judges that sentence people to death, there's such a huge gap between that sentence and the sentence actually being carried out. I mean, in some cases, 30, 40 years. And so, again, I mean, we have a legislature that, I mean, quite frankly, doesn't know what they're talking about. I mean, they're passing something that they don't know what they're talking about. I think that they are interested in getting executions going again. I think there's a thought that if we have a death penalty and these sentences are getting handed out, then we need to carry them out. But obviously, again, I'm opposed to the death penalty, but I just think that you can't you can't just keep on envisioning new ways to kill people regardless of what you're actually doing in terms of torturing people. I'm sorry, Andrew. I hope that answered your question.
One moment.
Josh?
Here we go. Josh, can you, let's see. Yeah. Josh Snyder?
Yes, and this is Josh Snyder with the Democrat Gazette. And I think there was some references to some previous attempts at legal challenges. But I was wondering if maybe y'all could say a little bit more. Are there any ongoing legal challenges specifically to execution by nitrogen hypoxia, or are there any plans to pursue legal challenges to this method in the future?
Yeah, of course. I mean, we're seeing that all over the country. I know that we're going to see that in Arkansas as soon as this is passed. I have no doubt that various attorneys representing these guys on death row are going to immediately go to court, and this is going to be a whole new court battle as to whether or not executions like this can happen in Arkansas. Um, I do think it's important to state that even judges, I mean, we don't have any film of these executions. We don't have any, all we have is witness accounts. And the question, of course, then becomes, are you going to trust the media? Are you going to trust the witnesses? And, I saw in the chat too that Anthony Bennett, he's very right. He says that the gas market is obviously much less regulated, and so even if you do file a some sort of lawsuit against a gas supplier, well, another gas supplier can just keep coming. I mean, again, we're talking about ease, and I think that people are assuming, and it thus far has shown to be nitrogen executions are easier to carry out and whatnot. Harder to litigate against, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
And I'll just add that we're not attorneys, and that's going to be on the attorneys representing the prisoners who get execution warrants. However, we have seen a repeated refusal by the courts in Alabama to really entertain the merits of the argument and to have a real examination of the suffering and the question of Eighth Amendment violations in these previous cases. And in one case, I think prior to the execution of Carrie Grayson, there was a request to film the execution so the court can see the suffering that's taking place while somebody is suffocating to death, and that was denied. And I'm again not the legal expert to be able to explain all the intricacies of that, but you can seek out the lawyers in those cases, or the filings that have been made in those cases.
Josh, I'll just want to quickly add that in Alabama, I filed a lawsuit before the execution, questioning whether or not it was safe for me to be in the execution chamber. And if it's not safe for the spiritual advisor to be in the execution chamber, then that's a violation of religious liberty. I think another thing that is eventually going to happen, and that I think we're going to see, is safety hazard sort of litigation. Is this safe for corrections employees? I think this is the first time that we have seen a method of execution, perhaps in U.S. history, maybe even beyond that, where the persons who are witnesses to the execution are at such risk as they are with nitrogen execution. So I think that we're going to continue to see that litigation. And I can assure you that anytime I'm involved, we will continue to see that litigation.
Let's see, Carla, I see your hand. Could you please put in the chat what news agency you are with? And then there's a question in the Q&A from James Powell, USA Today, for Reverend Hood. Do you think having state legislators hear the description of gas suffocation would sway pro-death penalty legislators away from the method?
Yeah, I think, James, thanks for joining us. Excuse me. I mean, I think that one of the things that we have to consider is, have we reached a point in our society where we are comfortable with this sort of moral apocalypse of, just suffocating people to death? I mean, that it has to be very clear that that's what we're talking about. We are talking about an execution method that is tantamount to putting a plastic bag over someone's head and holding it until they're dead. I don't see how any legislator could hear something like that and not be swayed. Now, I think it's important to say, we all make mistakes. And if one of our family members, somebody's kid, somebody who, has screwed up, if they're in this situation, I mean, would you want them to have to go through this? Would you want your kid who wants to be a corrections officer to have to go through this? I mean, would you, if somebody you love was murdered and you went to an execution, would you want them to have to witness this? Again, I think that these folks are not considering these things. So, I mean, James, to your question, I mean, I hope that we are able to explain and describe what's happening, and we can see some kind of movement. But I just hope that the addiction that many Americans and perhaps many Arkansans have to the death penalty doesn't blind them to torture and suffocation and just the evil that this method exposes so many in our state and in our wider society to or could.
James has a follow-up, but I want to just address in the chat, there's a question from Yvonne from Germany seeking clarification. She's asking, are you saying that nobody who votes for gas executions, that they don't know what they're allowing? And that is what we're saying, is that unless you've witnessed this, if you've not witnessed this, then you have no idea what it really is.
It's quite possible. I mean, Abe, we've talked about this. It is quite possible that I'm the only person in the state of Arkansas that has actually witnessed a nitrogen hypoxia execution. And that speaks to how rare these things are. Perhaps there's a state official that maybe traveled to see what one looks like. I mean, I could see something like that, but you're talking about a minuscule amount of people that have actually seen a nitrogen hypoxia execution. Certainly, the dozens and dozens of legislators that are co-sponsoring this bill have not.
James has a follow-up, and then Andrew has one in the Q&A. So, James?
Yes. So obviously, being on the state legislative level, we've seen where, it's not quite as, cut and dry partisanly, right? It's not, at least on the state level, there's a little bit more, or I've seen there's a little bit more willingness from, the Republicans in some state legislators to be against a particular method or even against death penalty as a whole. Does that give you, any sort of hope or any sort of avenue of how to argue this out, and that maybe your arguments will at least be heard?
James, as an old Southern preacher, I am always preaching for a decision. I'm always hoping that righteousness or the right way to do things might pierce people's hearts. So I think that when you function like that, hope springs eternal. I think that these folks in the legislature are made in the image of God. Their hearts can be pricked, and they can turn away from this evil method of execution. So I got to have hope, James. That's what I got to say. That's what I've got to say. I've got to have hope. But right now, it is looking very, very dark.
Thank you, Jeff. I want to take a crack at this next question from Andrew Langford and then pass it to you, Jeff. Andrew's follow-up is, do you believe proponents of this method support the pain and terror inflicting on the inmate, effectively turning, hopefully, dispassionate justice into vengeance? And if so, what do you think is driving this mindset in our culture? I'm sure Jeff has something a bit more robust in terms of an answer, but I will say that so far the only people that we have seen in Alabama, which is the only place that this has taken place so far, the only people who have witnessed one of these executions who say it works are state officials, the attorney general and others whose job it is to carry these out. But what they promised people was that unconsciousness would come within seconds. And what we have seen over and over again is that unconsciousness, literally being able to see a prisoner's eyes close and stop, struggling in such an emphatic way, takes minutes at least. And then still more minutes that you can see the bodies moving and that sort of thing. And I'm just going on what has been reported because obviously I've never been a witness to one of these. But the idea that people want to use something, having heard what we have seen over and over again, what people who've seen these executions have come out and said, what is the motivation? If you understand what's happening here, what's being done, and if you have traveled, as I have, to the death chambers of Nazi death camps where people were suffocated to death using Zyklon B, cyanide gas, or in the petition I gave out for our petition, there's a deposition testimony by people who witnessed cyanide gas executions in Arizona, which has a still functioning gas chamber that's available for choice of prisoners who were sentenced to death before 1992. The suffering that goes on, the pain that goes on in that kind of execution is significant. And I want to take a moment also just to address this as a Jewish person, as a co-founder of an organization called L'chaim, which means to life, L'chaim, Jews Against the Death Penalty, which opposes the death penalty. And in fact, in Louisiana on Monday morning, there was a press conference by Jews Against Gassing, a Louisiana group that is basically making the argument that in choosing this method of execution, you're choosing to re-traumatize the Jewish community. And we're all saying, no, we're not saying that this is like Nazi Germany and the Nazi death camps, but just the idea of suffocating a prisoner, that's one more bit of insult to a part of your community that they're talking about. But they are choosing, in having the death penalty and in using this form of execution, they are choosing more suffering. And they're visiting that suffering not just on the prisoner and that person's family, but also on everybody else involved in the execution process. And in particular, on the people that actually have to carry it out, that are hands-on with it. The mental torture of the death penalty starts from the moment that a person is told, you're going to fry for this. We're going to try to get the death penalty for you. That's when the mental torture starts. But from the moment that you're asking prisoners, as we are doing right now across this country in some states, make a choice. How do you want to die? Gas, lethal injection. And by this Friday, the man next set to be executed in South Carolina must choose between electric chair, lethal injection, or firing squad. Just that torture that is being visited on prisoners is something that we should all be asking, is this what we really want to do? But I can guarantee you, there are some legislators, and I have met them over my 30 years doing this, who want it to be the worst thing possible. And I'll share with you also that several legislators have actually changed their vote to and their position on the death penalty to instead be for death by incarceration, which is a more appropriate way of saying life in prison without the possibility of parole. It's actually death by incarceration, throw away the key, that's worse. And therefore, I've seen legislators actually change their vote to vote for a death penalty abolition bill. We've abolished the death penalty in a number of states legislatively now. And some of the votes we've gotten are from legislators that just want it to be the worst thing it can be. And they recognize that life without parole, dying in prison, is worse than execution. And that's what they want. So there's no question that that motivation is out there. Jeff?
I think, Andrew, I appreciate your question. It's hard to ascribe morals to anyone, I guess, or motives or anything like that. But I will say that obviously I care about all the guys that I work with on death row, and they're important to me. And I care about their experiences and what might happen to them and such things. But if these legislators don't care about the pain and suffering of these condemned persons or these prisoners, they should at least care about the pain and suffering of corrections officers. They should at least be concerned about the pain and suffering of pastors, rabbis, imams, clergy throughout the state of Arkansas. They should care about victims' family members who have to watch these things. This isn't just about the pain and suffering of the condemned. It's about the pain and suffering of everyone else who participates in the process.
I'll just share one other quick anecdote, and that is when Arizona resumed executions a couple of years ago. They had a set of 3 executions, and they executed Clarence Wayne Dixon on May 11th, 2022. I was out there outside the prison protesting the execution, and after it was all done, we went to a nearby restaurant, a Chinese restaurant right across the street from where it was all done, where the protest was on the edge of the prison. And there was a woman there that was eating, and she saw us in our T-shirts, and she came over and asked what had happened, if there had been an execution. And we said yes. And then she said, well, was it lethal injection or gas? And we said it was lethal injection, and she expressed her relief, and then she shared with us, and she wouldn't let me record this, and she wouldn't give us her name, but she shared with us that she was a former corrections officer. She had come to that restaurant because it was a favorite of hers, but she saw us and she wanted to ask, and she shared with us that she was present in her guard tower over the execution chamber in Arizona for 7 executions, the last of which was the execution of Walter Legrand, who was executed by a German national, executed by gas. And she said that she had to wear a gas mask, and she had to endure listening to the screams as he was executed using cyanide gas for several minutes. And it made her go and request a transfer. And she shared with us that she could still hear those screams today. And that's why one of the things that Jeff shared about the trauma that we're asking state workers to take on when they carry this out. It doesn't matter what method we're using. We're asking state workers to take on the trauma of killing a person who is otherwise we can hold them harmless. And they're certainly not the same person that committed the crime that got them on death row. 20, 30, now even 40 years later, we're executing an old person. You know, the first person they're going to execute in Louisiana in a few weeks, it's what we call a wheelchair execution. This man is so sick and feeble that he's going to be wheeled into the death chamber. I mean, and when you ask somebody to kill a person like that, you know, it's one thing if it's in a war and you're shooting each other and you kill the enemy, or police come across a bank robbery and shoot each other and shoot at the criminals. But once you have disarmed a person and you can hold them harmless, that's a whole different kind of killing. And no state worker should have to take that burden on. And we have seen repeatedly former state workers who've carried out executions leave that work and join our movement, because they have come to understand that we don't need executions in order to hold people accountable or to punish them severely. And what we're doing is giving more punishment and pain to the state workers whose job it is to do it. And that's just wrong.
I wanted to quickly, I'm going to go to Kwame, and then I wanted to go to Anthony Bennett. He asked a number of questions further up in the chat. So, Abe, can you give Kwame the ability to speak?
Yes, I can. He had a question in the chat, but where'd I go? Sorry. And Andrew, yes, I'll email out the links to everybody that has registered for this. Kwame, here we go. Well, Kwame's in here like 3 times, but I'm gonna. Kwame, can you unmute and
Okay, here it is. This Kwame Abdul-Bey with the APJMM Noose to Needle project. I'd just like you, Reverend Hood, as a man of the cloth, to kind of talk about the irony of a supposedly pro-life state wanting to advocate for not only the death penalty, but this particular type of execution with the nitrogen suffocation.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing pro-life about suffocating someone to death. I mean, I think, like on a very, very basic level, there is nothing pro-life about suffocating someone to death. A society that grows comfortable with these gruesome methods of execution, I don't think has any understanding of what it means to be pro-life. Um, I think about life as something that is so much more than just birth. I mean, it's healthcare, it's education, it's has to do with the environment, and I could go on and on and on. I mean, but I do know that in order to create a culture of life, you can't teach young people not to murder each other by murdering people. You can't teach young people not to suffocate each other by suffocating people. We are at a point here in Arkansas where we have to ask very real questions about what our values are. Not just lip service, not just catchphrases or cliches, but what are our values? If our children are the epicenter of our values, then we have to think about what we are teaching our children by suffocating people to death. And as far as I'm concerned, I don't want my children, my 5 children, to grow up here in Arkansas thinking that it's okay to suffocate people to death. My faith teaches me to love my neighbor as I love myself. You cannot love your neighbor and exist comfortably in a society of nitrogen suffocation executions.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kwame. Kwame, I also, before Anthony goes, Abe, could you go ahead and give Anthony Bennett the chance to speak? Kwame, before he comes up, I did too want to say that there's a scripture that says that there's a lot of people who will shout, Lord, Lord, but they know not of God. I think we got a lot of people in Arkansas that say a whole lot about God. They say a whole lot about Jesus. They say a whole lot about religion. But you can't say such things and then be about suffocating people at the same time. You can't talk about how much you love Jesus and how much you love suffocating people at the same time. I mean, even saying it right now, it's unbelievable to me that I'm even having to talk about this. I mean, maybe there was a point in my life where my parents taught me it was not appropriate to suffocate people, but I don't necessarily remember that. I mean, I feel like that's innate, but I don't know.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Would that you'd ever have to have such a conversation with your parents. Anthony?
Hey, first and foremost, let me apologize for talking through a cold here. I've been wanting to ask a couple questions from people who've witnessed these. The commissioner in Alabama, John Hamm, he's described what Kenneth Smith went through as agonal breathing, which for people who don't know what that is, a group that I think might include John Hamm, agonal breathing is a series of just infrequent gasps that are a physiological reaction to cardiac arrest. They're very deep and they're infrequent, and paramedics don't look for that because they know it's insufficient. Does that kind of infrequent deep gasp, is that something you think you might have? Is that something that that reflects your experience witnessing that?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I'm sure Commissioner Ham is a wonderful person. I'm sure that his children love him, his family loves him, and I'm sure that I would have a wonderful conversation with him if I ever got the opportunity. But the way that he has described these executions is absolutely absurd. I mean, I can't imagine the tenacity or the coaching it must take to witness what I saw and then get in front of a microphone and describe something that was absolutely almost the exact opposite of what I saw. with that said, Anthony, I think that when we talk about agonal breathing, you know, it feels like when people ask, okay, were they still breathing 15 or 16 minutes in? And you say, okay, well, that was agonal breathing. I'm not talking about 15 or 16 minutes in. I'm talking about the first 8 to 10 minutes of heaving back and forth and back and forth. I mean, we shouldn't have to talk about agonal breathing because you can see with your own eyes everything that happens before that point. I mean, I could see Kenny desperate to breathe. Witnesses to the other executions are 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 describing them desperate to breathe. I mean, you can see these gasps. I mean, we're not talking about, these final gasp of someone's life. We're talking about labored breathing and consciousness. I mean, I find it again just it just seemed like he would have to have a lot of training. Maybe they send him to drama camp before all of these things happen. But it is absolutely when they get out there and they say this is textbook. Well, I mean, I think to myself, whose textbook? I mean, the devil's? Is that the textbook we talking about? Because that's what I saw. That's the level of evil that I saw.
Gotcha. Thank you.
When it's when it's textbook, it means I take that by the guy ended up dead. That's the textbook.
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
Other question.
I mean, I think Anthony, just to completely answer your question, he was breathing as if someone who was um, underwater, struggling to breathe, would be trying to breathe, gasping for breath. I mean, we're just not talking about something that was involuntary or easily dismissed. I mean, I think that that's absolutely absurd. You might be able to describe that as how he was functioning 16, 17 minutes in, but I'm talking about, you know, minutes upon minutes of absolutely awful heaving and seeking to survive in the midst of being suffocated to death.
Gotcha. Thank you. Just one more question. I actually wasn't aware of the air monitoring that they did. Can you go into any more detail about that? I know that might have been a fairly
Sure.
minor part of the experience
I
for you.
guess they're called is it oximeter? Is that the right word? Uh,
Oximeter, yeah.
Oximeter to describe an oxygen monitor. Yeah, they were all over. There was probably from the moment I came into the waiting area, which is where Kenny was, the holding cell, there were at least probably six of those. And and I remember being very concerned because the first one I saw wasn't working. And um, I'm not sure, like if they were recalibrated. I'm not sure if they knew how to use them. I'm not sure about any of that. All I know is that um, I was told to, keep my eye and, make sure it doesn't start beeping, basically. But the problem with something like that is we were never told what to do if the thing did start beeping. So that was another scary part is, there was never, if somebody collapsed, there was no indication of what we were supposed to do. I mean, it's like, a lot of these situations, government is just telling us, hey, trust us, just trust us. And I mean, I think we consistently see what happens when we trust government too much. And I think that that's what we're talking about here with these nitrogen suffocation executions in general. We have government saying, trust us. And I think for our conservative friends out there, it seems to me that, if you have a distrust of government to begin with, how in the world could you trust the government with the right to take its citizens' lives?
All right, thank you. I'll go ahead and mute myself again.
Yeah, thank you.
Let's see, we have another question in the Q&A. Have either of you spoken directly with Representative Wardlaw about this bill? I have not.
Andrew, I didn't even know who Representative Wardlaw was until yesterday. I would love the opportunity to speak to him, but it seems to me by the dozens upon dozens of co-sponsors that they have gotten for this bill that their mind is pretty much made up.
Yesterday, we counted 63 co-sponsors, and there's, what, 100 legislators in the Arkansas?
100 legislators. I think it was 63 co-sponsors. So, Andrew, if you were able to make that happen, I'd love to talk to him. But, you know, I also think that this is something that they want, and they're pushing as hard as they can, as quickly as they can to make it happen. I guess what I'm trying to say, Andrew, is Representative Wardlaw, in the way that this has been presented and brought forward, they're not interested in dialogue. I'll be at the hearing tomorrow at 10 a.m. This is going to be heard before the House Judiciary Committee. I'll be there for that. But I'm not expecting a miracle. And maybe I should. I'm a man of faith. I should expect a miracle.
Okay, last call for questions. Well, thank you all for attending today. Wow, I set this for 30 minutes and here we are at 60. So it's been a robust dialogue. I'm going to share on our way out a video of a man named Ron McAndrew. This is in a series that we have on our webpage called The People versus the Death Penalty. Ron McAndrew is a red hat wearing MAGA, total Trumper kind of guy, but he's also the person who as warden of Florida State Penitentiary, carried out the last 3 electric chair executions in Florida. And he is a part of our organization. He's a donor. He doesn't like it when we talk about Donald Trump, but he is absolutely, vehemently opposed to the death penalty because of what carrying out executions did to him. So I'm going to put a link to that in the chat here, and then I'm going to show that video as our closeout for today. And thank you again for attending and being a part of this program.
Yeah, thank you. Real quick, Abe, thank you, everybody. And I'm going to, as this is playing, I'm going to put my, I guess, phone number and email address in the chat if anyone needs to get in touch with me.
I grew up on a small farm. There was a lot of Bible reading in front of the fireplace in the evenings. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth was often used not just as a quote from the Bible, but it was an expression that we should use and believe in. And I did. I grew up supporting the death penalty simply because I thought it was the right thing. That's what I was told. That's what I believed. I was starting to have a mental anguish, trouble sleeping, drinking huge amounts of alcohol, trying to numb the stress. There was a point after I left Florida State Prison that these men would come and sit on the edge of my bed at night. I told my wife that I was being haunted by the men that I had actually helped leave this world. The black skin, once you've electrocuted someone, gets an ash color to it. And they still had that color on their faces when they would sit on my bed. I could see them. They'd just look at me, you know. Pedro Medina will always be paramount in my mind and when I think about these things.
Is he one of the ghosts?
He's one of the ghosts. Yeah. When I gave the signal to the executioner, it was a pop. And if you've ever done a light switch or something and there was a pop, you know instantly that something's wrong with the electricity. And within a few seconds, the smoke and fire came out from underneath that copper helmet. In fact, came right up in front of my face, because I stand about 3 feet away from the electric chair. And it just kept smoking, and the smoke got blacker and blacker and blacker. And the electrician, who's wearing these big lineman gloves, had his hands ready to take the helmet off of his head, and he looked at me and said, "Continue, continue." There was no way we could stop at that point. I said, "Absolutely, continue." And the room filled with smoke. I ordered the colonel to open the window to let the smoke out. The smoke went upstairs where all the inmates on death row could smell burning flesh. I had it all over my body. I threw my clothes away that day. I couldn't scrub hard enough to get the smell off of me. Everybody in the room, the colonel, sergeant that's on the phone with the governor, we were all covered with this mess. And it was a bad day. The wriggling of his body, his arms trying to grip the table, and his heaving of his chest. I believe that he knew he was being burned to death. And I really don't want that feeling to go away. I want to remember that until my last breath. I want to remember it so I can tell it to people like you and to anybody else who will stand in front of me long enough to hear it. A premeditated ceremonial political killing, that's what I call it. This is much less than what we should be as Americans. Much less.
Hey, Abe.
One moment.